Welcome to Caligula's Council, where every day is Christmas in the Trumpenreich. I'm Count Nothing Face.
I'm One Irradiated Watson.
And I'm Anti-Dem. Nice to be here with the panel.
Mm-hmm. So today, our discussion is going to consist of A Christmas Carol. We're a little late to the Christmas party, as it were, but we want to talk about this anyway. Because a while back, I found this talk from, I can't remember the name of the institution, but I'll provide a link in the description of the video. There was like this group of academics that wrote a series of essays on Thomas Carlyle. And one of them remarked in this talk that you can't understand Dickens without understanding Carlyle. So what we thought would be fun would be to just read up on A Christmas Carol, since it's the latter-day Christmas season, as it were, and just kind of see what kind of Carlylean insights, we could glean from this work from Dickens all the way back in 1843.
Does it help that I've only seen Scrooged? Hey, it's Bill Murray.
It's probably, you probably got the gist of it then.
No, actually, I do. So for those of you who don't know, and sorry, Aaron Clary, I guess it is worthless, I do have a master's degree in English literature, and I really did write my master's thesis on Charles Dickens, so I will bring whatever I learned that wasn't social justice to this conversation.
Yeah.
My only previous experience with Dickens was the Disney Scrooge with, was it Scrooge McDuck, Christmas Carol.
What about Muppet Christmas Carol?
I never saw a Muppet Christmas Carol. I only saw was it Disney with the ducks?
That's with, the Scrooge, the DuckTales one?
DuckTales one,
yeah, that was
that's
Disney.
One. But I have read A Christmas Carol now, and I don't think I could have gotten anything out of it when I was younger, because it's not something you can really get unless you get out of the silly mindset we all in. Like it's an interesting tale if you haven't kind of taken the red pill, but after you've taken it, it becomes much more enjoyable as a story. Which is not to say it's a particularly red pill story, just it has something a little deeper to it.
Well, the reason why it has so many adaptations in the present day is just because the story is so relatable and the message itself is so timeless. So, like, the whole premise is just, like, there's this really rich guy, Ebenezer Scrooge, and he is completely materialistic, avaricious, and has no care and utter contempt for everyone around him.
He was, I quote, "a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster."
Mm-hmm. Right. So,
yeah, Dickens was never particularly one to couch things in terms.
No, he doesn't mince words.
Well, the thing about Dickens is what makes Dickens still relevant. There were tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of books in his time by one reformer after the other. Everyone from Edmund Morris to Theodore Dreiser and everyone in between. And, you had stuff like Upton Sinclair writing The Jungle and all that, and all these books advocating some kind of reform. And almost all of them are completely forgotten now. Even ones that were very, very popular in their time. For example, we've talked about Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy. For those of you who aren't familiar, this was a novel looking backward, and its sequel, which you can kind of figure out from its title, is called Equality. Well, what's that about? Where basically this guy who was a Massachusetts preacher, there's strike two, came up with this sort of Christian socialism that for a time in the late 19th and early 20th century, there were a lot of people who thought that this was a credible alternative to Marxism. Mm-hmm. And, there were societies dedicated to studying it and all that, and it kind of faded away, especially as Marxism did rise. Now, the problem with writing a book like that, the problem with writing something like, The Jungle, that complained about food safety at the time and how unsanitary things were, is once you pass sanitary food laws and establish the FDA, now there is no reason for anybody to read your book anymore. You've consigned it to the level of a historical curiosity. And the problem is in the 19th century, things moved very quickly. Urbanization and industrialization happened very quickly. But the problems that they created, and those problems were very real. When Friedrich Engels talks about walking through the slums of industrial era Manchester, and right around the time Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, and the misery and poverty that was there, he wasn't exaggerating. It really was that bad, and it could make anybody say, hey, somebody ought to do something about this. But of course, Engels and Dickens came to very different conclusions about what somebody should do about this. Engels was a revolutionary, obviously, Karl Marx's co-author. And, he wanted to foment the revolution, change the world, put the workers in charge. Dickens wasn't a revolutionary. He was a reformer. And in fact, another novel of his we're going to get to eventually, A Tale of Two Cities, his whole idea was, the whole message he was trying to send was, we need to reform or there will be a revolution like this, which will be a complete disaster. Mm-hmm. And that reform actually did come pretty quickly. For people at the time, it seemed like it was taking forever. But as we look back now, things got better very, very quickly. So that the Marxist revolution never happened in places like England and Germany, which is where Marx thought it would happen, because things had gotten better to the point that the workers didn't feel the need to rise up anymore. Instead, you had communist revolutions happening in creaky old backwater agricultural states like Russia and China. Mm-hmm. So for Dickens, his whole thing is not, he was never a believer that we could, he did favor some reforms, but he was never one to think that you can just pass this law or that law or the other law and we're going to make everything better. He didn't believe that was possible. What he believed was something that is both incredibly simple, but also is what makes his work completely timeless, which is people should just be kinder to each other.
Pretty much. And that's basically the message of A Christmas Carol, is where Scrooge goes through a sort of spiritual, like literally a spiritual journey, where he is taken to the past, the Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas future, and he sees aspects of himself that he needs to change, or else he's going to die alone, no one will care for him, and he's going to be a miserable person for the rest of his life.
And don't forget the spiritual punishment in the next life that Jacob Marley presents to him.
Right. So for those who haven't, the two of you listening who probably are not familiar with A Christmas Carol, Jacob Marley's chains represent, when Jacob Marley's Scrooge's former business partner who's died, visits Scrooge in the night to tell him that he's going to be visited by three spirits, and he's bearing a chain which ties him down to the material world. He can't ascend into the next life because of his deep-seated commitment to the material world.
And it's interesting because Marley talks about everyone has a chain. Some are long and heavy, and some are short. But like the longer and heavier the chain, the more sin and connection to materialism you have. And you can see Scrooge just imagining his own chain and how heavy it would be and how it will drag him back. Mm-hmm. But it's an interesting metaphor. Like when you describe it outside of the context of the book, it seems a bit on the nose, like chains tying you down. But in the book, it feels realer. It feels fluid. It feels natural.
And there's sort of a paradox, if you think about it, too, with the fact that there is, like, Jacob Marley is a ghost. He's incorporeal, and yet you have this material chain holding him down to the earth.
And what must be said about that, too, is, Dickens wasn't exactly the world's biggest Bible thumper, but he was a Christian, and Christianity does show through all of his works. Mm-hmm. And this is one where it's very clear he's trying to make a point that is made sort of a lot in Christianity, which is God doesn't send you to hell. You send you to hell. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Where Marley says, I forged these chains of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore them. Well, yeah, those are of nobody else's making but his own. Mm-hmm. He's the one who is responsible for what happened to him. And, Scrooge, when he decides to change, is the one who gets rid of them.
Right.
In the end, the devil can whisper in your ear, but the decision is your own, and the responsibility is your own.
Yeah, and and also Scrooge's changes, they sort of play into what the idea of Dickens as a reformer, because what changes Scrooge isn't a system, and what makes him a generous person isn't like a system of beliefs. It's simply exposure to people. And, he doesn't he doesn't get rid of all of his riches or anything, but he is more generous with them, and he still remains a rich person. Mm-hmm. But he takes on, but he uses his riches to take on an entirely different role, a more generous, more Christian role.
Right. It seems like the modern take on it is very materialist, because the book describes him as greedy and covetous, but it makes sort of a character judgment on him throughout the script, in that those qualities kind of carry on throughout the movie, whereas in the book he's greedy and covetous, but then he sees the light and he immediately realizes the gravity of the situation. It's like he was going through life sleepwalking, and suddenly he sees, oh, I actually have to change, and it makes him much more human and relatable, because you see that he had good qualities in him somewhere. He wasn't aware of his situation. He didn't see his future and where he was going. And it has that sort of natural law-like feel, like these consequences are catching up with you, and you need to change before them.
Well, certainly there's a message of redemption is possible at any point. And,
right.
That's a transformation. Mm-hmm. The old person isn't even really there anymore.
Mm-hmm. Right.
When Scrooge wakes up on Christmas morning, he is a different person. Mm-hmm. And also, there's also, though, something that Dickens comes back to a lot, and which is forgotten by sort of modern critics, which is the idea of the divide between the deserving rich and the undeserving rich, the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. Everybody makes this big thing about, Dickens believed in giving everything to everybody. No, he didn't. Mm-hmm. Let's not forget the happy ending of Oliver Twist is when Fagin gets dragged out of Newgate Prison and hung. That's that Dickens was very clear to say there are poor people who deserve their own situation and don't deserve our help, just as there are rich people like Jacob Marley who are responsible for their own situation and don't deserve any sympathy. Mm-hmm. And that's something certainly that there's a divide between Christian charity, which Dickens believed in, and the Victorian charity that was based on it, and the modern welfare state of let's just give free money to any old people who behave any old terrible way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's more akin to Marxism and socialism than to Dickens.
Yeah, and I'm working on a blog post right now that would be essentially, I'm planning to call it Down and Out in Christania, where I take this fictional idea of a completely Christian kingdom. What would public charity look like there? Mm-hmm. And it would be very different from the welfare state we've got.
Right.
Because ours is not based on Christian charity.
Mm-hmm. I have a little passage here that kind of illustrates, I think, Dickens' kind of feelings on this sort of public solutions, maybe, where it maybe sheds a little light. And in it, Scrooge is asking, I think he's asked to make a donation, and he's reluctant. And so he says, "Are there no prisons?" asks Scrooge. There are plenty of prisons, said the gentleman, laying down on the pen again. And the union workhouses, demanded Scrooge. Are they still in operation? They are still, returned the gentleman. I wish I could say they were not. The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor then, said Scrooge. Both are very are, sir. Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them from their useful course, said Scrooge. I'm very glad to hear it.
Well, okay, this is where we live at the other side of 150 years of experience from Dickens.
Right.
Which is, as someone has said, during any Enlightenment, some good ideas come to the fore and a lot of bad ideas come to the fore.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody really quite exactly knows which is going to be which until everybody starts trying them out.
Mm-hmm.
So we know, for example, that all the science and technology that came out of the scientific method and all that, hey, great stuff. Like P.J. O'Rourke once said that his perfect world would be the 18th century, but with penicillin and air conditioning. And I think if you ramped it up to the Victorian age and added smartphones, I'd be about there with that. But there's also a lot of bad ideas. And Dickens was... The poorhouses of Dickens' time were very harsh. But there were a lot of people, even at that time, who said that if you made them too nice, people would just flop in them and give up and never get a job and never better themselves. And it turns out those people were right.
Mm-hmm. Carlyle, I think, thought along those lines. He has a long passage in the Latter-day Pamphlets where he pins this speech from an anonymous senator, quote unquote, and he's basically he's looking at these poorhouses or workhouses, and he's calling them vagrant lack-alls, and he says, if I was in charge, I could make them do work. And he is very adamant that the workhouses are there to reform through the nature of hard work, and they're not there for people to sit around. And he also goes on and talks about the problems of drunkards, that, he wants to take the drunkards out of the ditches and throw them in the workhouses because they're not doing any good to anyone by drinking all their wages and sleeping in the gutter.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, let's not forget, part of the New Testament there is, St. Paul saying, he who will not work, let him also not eat. Mm-hmm. There is a definite distinction, a dividing line in Christian charity between helping people who cannot work and helping people who will not work.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
For, old widows and orphans and the blind and the crippled, there is endless charity for them because they cannot work. But for those who will not work, St. Paul tells us directly, no, let them starve in the street. Because it's understood, if you just start handing out cash to people who are just work shy or just don't want to contribute, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to do that. Mm-hmm. And you'll overwhelm your ability to help the people who actually do need it. What if we pared down our social welfare programs to just helping people who couldn't work? How much more, forget how much money we'd save in taxes, how much more money could we spend on helping those people?
Right. I think there's this odd problem where, for people on welfare, and I'm no expert on it, there's a question of who's going to get the welfare and how much are they going to get. And I think oftentimes it's kind of the wrong answer. Is the people who have who are in the most need and maybe in the most deserving of whatever help they get. Not that I'm just justifying the system itself. Are the people who get the least and the people who are the most vagrant, the most lack all, as Carlyle might say, are the ones who are reaping in the benefits because that's their focus, is they're putting all their energy into getting what they can.
Right.
Right. And to bring that back to Dickens for a second, he makes great pains to make sure that we see that Bob Cratchit is the deserving poor. He's a working man with a crippled son. Mm-hmm. That makes the case for deserving poor.
On that note, there's a little nod to Malthus. Did Dickens talk about Malthus much?
Not really.
Or is it was just kind of a fashionable thing to throw in there?
Well, I mean, you can kind of see allusions, but not anything. He didn't spend a lot of time on it.
Okay.
Because
certainly,
you're talking about the surplus
The
population.
surplus
line,
population.
right?
I heard that. I thought that's
it's straight
out
out
of Malthus.
It is straight out of Malthus. Like the line where Scrooge says, if they're going to die, they might as well do it to get rid of the surplus population.
Yeah, there you go. There's a very Planned Parenthood sentiment.
Also, also a fairly popular sentiment back then in the Victorian times, if I remember correctly.
And I think it's a popular sentiment in the right circle today. I mean, I can't remember what's the name of the book, but I remember going through elementary school and learning about the problems of overpopulation.
Well, okay. The problem with that is that it's another one of those things that the political left sees when they want to and doesn't see when they don't want to.
Well, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, you could say, hey, if overpopulation is really a problem, should we really be taking in 1 million immigrants a year?
Right.
Especially in California. I mean, the problem with California, and here's where, they'll admit that there's such a thing as global overpopulation, but not such a thing as regional overpopulation.
Mm-hmm.
California is hugely overpopulated. Way past the ability of the very considerable resources of this state, by the way, to support that many people. I mean, have you ever seen the Los Angeles River? It's like this little creek that runs through the middle of town, and that's supposed to be drinking water for 15 million people.
Yeah.
And the state spends so much money on total bullshit that it hasn't built any desalination plants. It hasn't built any new energy plants in 30 years. It won't upgrade any of its infrastructure. It keeps coming up with these dumb pie-in-the-sky ideas like a bullet train through the Central Valley to nowhere, when we've been talking about running BART from Fremont to San Jose for 20 years, and that still hasn't happened. I mean, that's certainly a lot of the problems that California has comes from the fact that it's just overpopulated. And if you keep taking population out of Mexico, then you dump it into America. Mexico fills back up to its carrying capacity, and the excess just keeps getting dumped on America until we're over our carrying capacity.
Right.
If anything, California is not the deserving poor. It is a state which has created its own problems, and it will lie in the bed it's created. I mean, whenever someone talks about this, they say, they'll bring up, desalination is expensive and energy is expensive, and I'm like, just hold on a second.
Yeah, having 30 million people in your state is expensive.
Well, even beyond that, this is one of the richest states as far as the amount of money that's flowing through this state. It rivals nations, literal nations. And if it can't find the resources to build, power station, desalination plants, and infrastructure, then I don't know what is worthwhile. We're talking about energy and water, which are some of the basic things that keep civilization going. And infrastructure is probably not far down the list. And what are they spending it on? I have no idea. I literally have no idea.
No, seriously, that's been California politics for 30 years. Dump billions of dollars into complete bullshit that never amounts to anything, while not spending money on all the stuff that actually needs to get done.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even just something like, that blackout they had in the Northeast that went on for 3-4 days. What happens if Silicon Valley loses power for 4 days?
Right. Well, I saw there was an article recently. Apparently, there's a rumor apparently that Peter Thiel is going to run for governor of California. So with him as governor, I think we can
make California great
make
again.
California great again. But between that and the Trump wall, I think that could solve a lot of problems.
Hey, we know that wall's going to work. Look, the Chinese built a big wall there thousands of years ago. There's no Mexicans there.
It's funny, I not to digress a bit, but there is one place where the Chinese still need to build a wall between them and North Korea. There's at the border with North Korea, there's a whole bunch of North Korean ghettos, because I don't know how able North Koreans are, but coming out of that environment, they're not very able people, and I mean, they're the low-wage workers who are flooding over the border into China.
What do you do with all those people?
Right.
Well, you would probably end up seeing something like the Flynn effect with them. So for those of you who don't know, the Flynn effect is when Irish immigrants first showed up in America, they were given intelligence tests, which showed basically they had IQs in the mid-80s. A couple generations later, they had the standard white IQ of about 100. And the reason for the discrepancy was they were just malnourished. They just weren't in very good shape. Right? Overworked, malnourished. By the time they got to the point where that wasn't a problem anymore, their IQ had drastically improved. So I wouldn't doubt if the IQ in North Korea is artificially depressed by the fact that their shitty government just can't put food in their bellies.
But that's a big reason why the Chinese are so supportive of the North Korean state, is because they don't want a equivalent of a Mexican flood coming to their country if that state destabilizes. I mean, imagine a couple million, I don't know how many, probably tens of millions of malnourished people flooding into your country, in a country that already has a problem with malnourished peasants or semi-malnourished peasants.
Yeah.
I once paid 3 girls in Tijuana to give me a Mexican flood. Don't believe that. That just came from 4chan, like the whole Donald Trump in Russia thing.
Let's see.
Moving on.
Back to Dickens.
I tell you, that was some yellow journalism. Was the #1 story all last week.
Listen, I believe you have something.
Yes. Ghost of the Departed Usurers.
Okay.
Where did this... Wait, what's that from?
That's the headline, the title of one of the sub-chapters.
Oh, man. That must not have been in my edition.
All right, so here's the thing. This brings us on to another topic, which is I am one of those people who really believes that we should go back to the old school Catholic view of usury.
Go on.
Go right ahead.
Okay, well...
I'm not well versed in
Catholic usury.
I should be. I feel like I should be more well versed in usury than I actually am.
Okay, so usury is in the Bible a very grave sin, and getting an exact definition of it is a little difficult. Some say it's the loaning of any money at interest. Others say it is only the loaning of money to a person at interest. So if you loaned money to a corporation or something like that at interest, that's not usury, but doing it to a person is. So you'll see a couple different definitions. And Zippy Catholic has, on his blog, just Google it, has this big long thing about usury. It used to be considered an extremely grave sin. And it's so much so that, in fact, the way that sort of the Jews of Europe built their wealth was they were the only people who would loan money at interest. Because, that was something that good Christians just didn't do. And that's how you get the whole thing about the Merchant of Venice. Shylock loaned money, now he wants it back, all of that kind of thing. So I think our society is way out of control on usury. At some point, the prohibitions against that and the social stigma against it just sort of dropped down to zero. But I think that was a really grave mistake. And I really think, there are other ways to do things. Usury is a sin in Islam too, and they take that seriously. And there are banks in Islamic countries. They figure out other ways to do it, risk sharing ideas and all of that. We're just obviously, we are way out of control with debt in our society. And we should really get back to, and I think eventually we're sort of going to be forced to be back to a very hard line on usury.
I'm much softer on usury. I understand the problems with that. I think that there are cruel and unfortunate ways to give out credit, but I take a more libertine view in that the usury is going to come about some way. So might as well choose the better, more healthy way to deal with the situation, because if you let the usury go to the black market, you're going to get worse things than payday loans.
Maybe, but I mean, geez, look at credit card debt. Look at the rates on credit card debt. Look at student loans. I mean, someone coming out of college without having had a day of work in their life with like $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 in debt at not completely non-dischargeable at astronomical rates. And it's all completely legal.
Yes, that's all completely legal, but I think those are, how do I say, those are like tertiary problems. Like, should we be really investing, that much money in, in high-level education for, 30-40% of the population? That's a bigger question. And then if you're answering that, then should you be able to take out a loan? Should the government be funding loans, which are essentially just throwing money at these institutions? And as far as credit cards go, that's a cultural thing. There are countries without credit cards, and I don't think there's anything wrong with credit cards, especially if you're a person of incredible wealth who has a lot of assets. But there's a question of, would things be better if we didn't ban credit cards, but we pushed it towards credit cards towards people who have more agency rather than pushing them on people who have little to no agency? And I think that's the cruel thing about usury, in my opinion. And this is not a theological opinion, but it's pushing credit and lending on people who do not have the agency to handle that sort of situation. That's what bothers me.
Well, yeah, but people who do have the agency to do that aren't going to get in that situation in the first place.
Right, but there are people with agency who may, under circumstances, need a loan, and I think it's my opinion that it's better to have, white market methods of giving loans to responsible people.
But the problem is, all we've really done is like legalize the worst possible thing. Like, it's sort of like the argument for legalizing abortion. Well, if we don't legalize it, it'll just happen in back alleys. Well, yeah, but it'll be much harder to do, and you haven't made less people suffer by legalizing
I don't
it.
think
There'll be more people dead.
I don't think when a millionaire takes out a loan to fund his business, he's suffering, and I think loans serve as a way to they transmit information into the economy, which wouldn't be there otherwise. If there wasn't an interest rate, you wouldn't know the future exchange rate of money. You wouldn't know how valuable future money is, and that's a valuable thing to know, because if you have really low interest rates, that means that people are not saving and they're not putting a high value on future money, and it is a way of gauging the time preference of society and pushing that time preference up. That's a valuable thing. That it's good to incentivize people to put money away.
Well, yeah, but if the millionaire goes in for a loan, he's not taking a personal loan in his own name. I mean, remember, usury only applies to individuals. It doesn't apply to corporations. The idea is that for someone being personally on the hook for that loan. So, if Donald Trump goes in and asks for $1 million from some bank, like, they're not writing him a personal check. That's going to the Trump organization, which has layers and layers and layers of, executives working for it.
Okay. Well, I think we can move on.
And of course,
this topic.
You will know what your money's worth if your money is gold. Drags us off in another direction.
All right.
Let's not open that can
the
of
Dickens digression hour. Let's see. What else can we dig out of Dickens? The Christian element is something that I knew had to be there, but it's a very warm and fuzzy element. I think it's done well in a sense that, although I have nothing against very explicitly Christian literature, I think it's done in a way that brings it in it's an assumption. It comes in and it feels Christian, but it's not a sermon. This book is not a sermon, and it's not bringing in the theological questions.
It feels like a natural part of the story to bring up the Christian ethics and the virtues of generosity and kindness.
Well, the fact that we even feel that way kind of has a lot to do with the fact that we live in the secular age. I mean, to people who do not live in secular societies or who did not live in secular times, there just was not any separation between your faith and how you lived your life,
right,
and how your society worked.
Mm-hmm.
To see those things as separate, that's a post-Voltaire, post-1776, post-Bastille way of looking at the world.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, people before a certain point wouldn't even have seen things that way.
Right.
I agree, and one of the things that bothers me oftentimes about modern books or media is not that they're explicitly anti-Christian, but that they're just written from a perspective that just it's empty in that sense. You notice the absence. You notice those moments when the person is inserting themselves in there implicitly and saying, these are my values, and they're going to carry you through this work, even if it's not beating you over the head with it or on the nose. There's this absence that when you read something like A Christmas Carol, it's refreshing, it's nice, it's very, very nice to have a work that has that sort of warm feeling to it.
So you don't want a book with, certain values there, Goy?
Oh my goodness.
The values of a certain tribe there?
The values of usury. The ghosts of usury past. But yeah, it's it is very refreshing to see that in Dickens. Let's see. What did I have here? Did you have something?
Yeah, sure. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a morning dress, in whose eyes were tears which sparkled in the light that shone out of the ghost of Christmas past. It matters little, she said. To you very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to, I have no just cause to grieve. What idol has displaced you? He rejoined. This is Scrooge talking to a girl. A golden one. This is the even-handed dealing of the world. There is nothing which is so hard as poverty. There is nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth. I kind of want to take a pause on the pursuit of wealth, because that's something that figures in the book, and I think a lot of the modern interpretations have missed what it is. I think the simple biblical understanding is not money which is evil, but the love of money which is evil.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that figures well in the book, in that Scrooge loves money, and he's focused on money, and part of what redeems him is learning to love people and seeing money just as a means, something that is part of what he does. And he, as Anti-Dem says, he uses his money very well in the end of the book, as it becomes part of bringing joy to people. And this book isn't about attacking money. It is about using money to help people and being just kinder.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the question. What is all this money for?
Right.
Right.
There is, at least, I don't recall if it was actually in the book or not, but in the 1952 movie version starring Alistair Sim, there's a scene where Scrooge is in a restaurant having dinner, and waitress walks by and he says, bring me some more bread. She says, halfpenny extra, sir. He says, no more bread. Well, what use is being rich if you can't even have a little extra bread that you want?
Right.
And he goes through this whole thing in love with a tool, in love with a means without an end.
Right.
And that's a really, really common trap for people to fall into in all kinds of ways. Again, I've got a blog post coming up talking about how government is properly seen as a means, not as an end. So if you say, I love democracy, or even I love monarchy, or whatever it is, that I love National Socialism or whatever, well, you're pointing in the wrong direction, because you're saying, I like a means, when the question should be, what are the ends that you want?
Mm-hmm.
People, it's almost like their love is misplaced, as in they know something good happens when they have money. They know something good happens when government works the right way,
but because that's what they directly touch. That's the thing that the first thing they think of, the first thing they come in contact with. They're like a duckling following a person who just happened to come between them and their mother and was warm. That's almost how I feel about it. It's you're attaching yourself to democracy because it brings these good things to you, when really you should be worried about those good things, and you can't disassociate it with democracy. You can't disassociate the warmth from the pant leg.
Right, because then you can't ever stop and say, hey, wait a second, is this government not doing what I want it to anymore?
Right.
Did it just stop? Did it stop 50 years ago?
Right.
And maybe I ought to look into something else. And, Scrooge, the problem is until what this does, what the visit from the ghost does, is sort of shake him into saying, what is this money doing for me? Sure, I've got plenty of means. What is the end? If you're sitting there just miserable alone in your house without even any extra bread in your stomach because you're too cheap to pay a halfpenny,
and the whole place is cold, and you're shivering by a small fire.
Yeah, you're not even making yourself happy, much less other people.
Right, and and that's like the key thing about like when Scrooge redeems himself, he winds up doing things and being more generous, and that ends up being better for himself, and he is a happier and healthier person as a result.
Right, he has figured out what his money is for.
Right, like the very first thing that he does when he wakes up Christmas morning is he calls out to this kid and tells him like, hey, here's a big sack full of money, buy this turkey out and like deliver it to this address and keep the change or whatever. So, like, the very first thing he does is an act of generosity to I believe he sends it to the Cratchit family, if I remember correctly. But, like, the very first thing he does is he starts giving his money to those who need it.
And he's seen this turkey before. It's just been hanging there, unused, and it doesn't do any good. Mm-hmm. And then that's
no one can afford it.
Right. What good is this great, expensive good if no one can afford it? And he brings it out to be appreciated. Mm-hmm. There's nothing wrong with a turkey that's too expensive.
Yeah, if I can connect this maybe back to Donald Trump for a little bit, I think that the people on the political left still think that Americans hate rich people, and we really don't. What we hate is rich people where we can't figure out how they got rich. Someone like Mitt Romney, what the fuck did Bain Capital do?
Right.
And we don't but we know what Trump does. You walk into any big city, you look up on the skyline, and there'll be a big building that says Trump there. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, well, we can figure that out. This guy got rich by building these big, huge buildings that are really useful. And also, we don't hate shows of wealth. Mm-hmm. Trump lives large and has his big, private jet and drives around in limousines, and nobody is resentful of that.
Right.
What we'd be resentful of is him doing that and being a dick. The Trump story, ever, is the time in the 80s he's driving his limo down the street, passes some dude who's being beat up by a mugger, stops the car, gets out with his security guy, and the mugger just takes off. And Trump goes, oh, okay, you all right there? Doing okay? Make sure the guy's fine before he moves on. Well, doing that instead of just driving by with his nose in the air is the kind of thing that makes people like him.
Right.
So, yeah, I don't think... Notice in this, Dickens is not saying don't be rich. Mm-hmm. In the Gospels, Christ doesn't really say don't be rich. I mean, there's this one incident of this rich person who comes up to him, says, I give half of all my money to the poor, and Christ says, you're blessed, keep it up, you'll get into the kingdom of heaven. I forget the exact, chapter and verse. But, he said, I give half my money to the poor. He didn't say, I give all my money to the poor and live in a burlap sack under a bridge. Mm-hmm. Right? It's one of those with great power comes great responsibility kind of things where, yes, being rich is not, again, with the difference between the love of money being bad and money being bad, it's not inherently bad to have money.
I think
It's
I think the passage that people point to the most is it's harder to get into heaven as a rich man than to walk through the eye of the needle, which I think it points to me, my layman's interpretation is that it points to the difficulty of being rich and dealing with money and the problems it presents. Not that it's inherently evil, it's just that there is extra temptations that come with being very, very wealthy.
There is actually an alternative interpretation of that, which is apparently one of the city gates into Jerusalem in the old days was called the Eye of the Needle. And it was this really small, narrow gate where a camel could get through it, but not if it was carrying anything. So you could get a camel through, but if it had a bunch of packs on its back and all that, it wouldn't be able to. So the idea would be, you can pass through, but you've got to leave all of your baggage outside.
Exactly. Much like Jacob Marley.
Right.
Yeah.
You can't be attached to your earthly possessions to pass through into the kingdom of heaven.
I've actually heard that before. I just never knew if it was actually true or just one of those kind of myths that got made up. But it's a great. If it's true, it's like it actually adds to the interpretation.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, it's a matter of interpretation with different people and all that.
Right, but it makes sense. Your wealth is not the thing that you're going to value at the end of your life.
Right. And this sort of goes into so tying this in with Carlyle, I think that Scrooge's turn to a charitable character reflects something not just Christian, but also in a way, I think it also points to Carlyle's influence on Dickens in a way. Because if you read Carlyle talks a lot about the social responsibilities of the captains of industry. And Moldbug springs off of that with neo-cameralism, saying that, good government is good customer service, and we should be concerned about, what is government doing for us? Not more like what Anti-Dem was saying, the ends rather than the means of government. And so while Dickens probably wasn't full Carlylean in the sense that Moldbug goes, where CEOs should have a social responsibility to be governors. Dickens does seem to say that rich people, those with the means and those with the wealth, have a sort of social responsibility to those who are basically to be like stewards and caretakers for the poor, to be, and this shows up constantly in Dickens. Like at the end of Christmas Carol, where in the end it says that
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became a good friend and a good master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or as any other old city, town, or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but let them laugh, and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good, at which some people did not have their fill of laughter in the outset. And knowing that such as these would be blind anyway, he thought it quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes in grins as have the malady in less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him.
Mm-hmm.
This comes back to A Tale of Two Cities, where the basic message is, Dickens looking across the English Channel at France, and there's a fair amount of old school English looking down on the French and looking down on Catholicism in A Tale of Two Cities. But looking across at the French and then sort of turning to England's nobles, which still had some currency at the time, and saying, you clowns better do better. Mm-hmm. You can't become the kind of wastrels that the French nobility did. The French nobility, the one region of France that stayed loyal during the French Revolution was the Vendée. And the Vendée was also the only part of France where the nobles had stayed on the land instead of, going off to France to drink and carouse and play cards. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not a coincidence.
Right.
The places where the nobles stayed and took care of their people was the place where, when things went bad for the nobles, the people turned up with their muskets to defend them.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Right.
Yeah, very Dickensian.
Yeah.
It is, as a small digression, it is interesting that going to the court was kind of a trap. It was something where you could be closer to power, but you ended up giving up what power you have. And I think that was Louis XIV's intention, was to, by bringing them to court, he would make them his nobles, his courtiers, rather than being the people who own land, the people who had their own power base. And that was part of Louis XIV's strategy, was he didn't want to be humiliated by nobles anymore. He wanted to be in charge, and he wanted to be the power that all power revolved around.
Sure, and that's why when he died, he said, "Après moi le déluge." You know, he made himself indispensable, and then he died.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
You know, well, that doesn't really work too well, does it? It's notable too. You know, the way Queen Victoria, when she came into power, she was very, very different in that she intentionally, in one of the first sort of big things about image control, you know, she made sure that paintings of her, and especially photographs of her when they became available, were posed. She would wear a dress that was upper class, but not like hugely ostentatious. And when I say that, remember that Queen Elizabeth I literally had all of the crown jewels of England sewn into her dress, so that she could literally walk around with like the power of the crown on her. Whereas Victoria had a very different way of doing things. She would be there in, you know, a nice dress, but nothing beyond the ability of sort of the upper middle class to afford, surrounded by her children, of which she had many, 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 many with Prince Albert. And the conscious idea was, this is the mother of the nation. Mm-hmm. You know, here she is, matronly, surrounded by children, that kind of thing. And it worked. You know, the British monarchy is still there. You know, her I think, great-granddaughter is still sitting on the throne, so...
Right. It's all about, you know, and it's, you know, being charitable and standing with your people. As Scrooge learns, and as he becomes a greater steward, he will be remembered, and he will carry on a legacy. Like in the case of Queen Victoria, in the case of all of the great monarchs of history, all of the great people, those who use their wealth to help the downtrodden, they're remembered, and that's why Scrooge avoids his fate. He, like in the Ghost of, when he is visited by the Ghost of Christmas Future, he is shown the future where he's dead. He is remembered. He's not remembered fondly. People are robbing him, and nobody respects his grave. And Tiny Tim is dead. So he has in a way, as I think Carlyle would probably put it, as a captain of industry, he has abandoned his responsibilities as an aristocrat. He hasn't, like, even though he didn't per se inherit his wealth, he still had a responsibility even with it. And since he neglected it, he would have, if he were to neglect that responsibility, he would end up dead and forgotten.
It's interesting. I think there's a sense of the personal and the impersonal in sort of the modern nouveau riche, and you know, donating $1 million to charity, donating $1 billion to charity, doesn't make people remember you. Like, it, as nice as it sounds, it doesn't make people remember you. It's when you build something personally, when you personally go down there and build the hospital, or you work in the poorhouses, or you invest yourself in the community. That's when people remember you, because there's a personal connection, because it's people who are on the other end. And if you put this machine between you and the charity, I don't know if it has a moral quality of it, but it certainly doesn't have that. It doesn't have that personal warmth and value that makes you a leader.
And it plays into why a lot of leftists just don't understand the Trump phenomenon. because Trump is that kind of person who, like Anti-Dem said, he is the kind of person who will go out among the people and talk with them, help them out. And that's not the image that so many liberals and progressives are used to when they think of rich people.
It's not Mr. Burns.
Right, exactly.
And the left literally thinks like Mr. Burns is what rich people are.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think, to my experience, to my knowledge, people like Bill Gates, he's more like Mr. Burns. He has his foundations, and he has his deals, and he has these wild-eyed plans, and he throws money at them till something happens or he gets upset and moves on. I mean, when the Gates Foundation wants to implement a new education plan, they just throw money at a school and say, you will adopt this curriculum, you will meet these standards, or you're not getting the money.
Or like Mark Zuckerberg throwing $100 million at the schools of Newark. Now, I grew up in New Jersey. It's an astoundingly corrupt state. I mean, like, even the nice areas that are full of white people are astoundingly corrupt. Mm-hmm. Which is why I just looked at Bridgegate and I was like, so? It's like, dude, by New Jersey standards, that's nothing. You know, and he takes this, like, crappy neighborhood full of corrupt politicians, throws $100 million at it, and is surprised when, like, 2 years later, he has, like, schools that are 0% improved and a lot of rich politicians.
Right.
The level of magical thinking that goes into the way people handle the world it's astounding. It really is truly astounding that the idea of corruption or failure or the limits of human ability to improve, that people are just so wild-eyed, optimistic about solving it, and they just keep throwing money at it over and over and over again, and nothing happens.
Yeah. Well, any system that has its basis in a fundamentally flawed vision of what human nature is doomed to fail. That's why communism failed. That's why anarchy will never really get anywhere. I mean, look, if you took every anarchist I ever knew, and I mean like every serious one, not like every dude who thinks it means that you get to sit on your back porch and puff weed and the cops won't arrest you, but I mean every serious anarchist, and put me on like a desert island with all of them, it'd go fine, because they're all the kinds of people with whom anarchy would work. They don't understand that the world is full of people who are fundamentally very different from them. If you took the 4 Chicago BLM kidnappers and let them go on Libertarian Island where there's 1 million responsible libertarians, pretty soon they really would be the Kangs. Because
or they would be physically removed.
Yeah. Either way, you could not have libertarian principles around them. It's not gonna work.
Yeah.
Which is why I think with certain libertarians like Cantwell and Molyneux and all that, you see this move towards the idea of there are certain people with which these ideas might work, but you cannot apply this universally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I've seen in previous years before the neo-reaction really came into its own, I saw a trend among anarchists towards there needs to be this sort of authoritarian middle state, as in we need to create our authoritarian state so that we can create a libertarian paradise. Which it is amusing, but at the same time it tells you something about people and human nature.
Well, yeah, it's a recognition that, I'm sorry, this is the most by the way, I spent my entire Christmas vacation reading refutations of universally preferable behavior.
Oh man,
why?
Stefan Molyneux
why
saying,
did you do that?
I still haven't even read that.
Yeah, don't even bother.
Yeah.
The one comment on it I saw that seemed to really nail it was, this is somebody's attempt to pass off programming logic as moral theory. Mm-hmm. And it really is. And it's the thing is, you really can't quite apply morality and certainly any theory of government universally because of people's varying ability to handle them. Like, it's obvious that the laws against rape that will restrain Swedes will not restrain Syrians or Pakistanis.
Yeah. At the same time, sometimes the laws are merely they're merely implications. Like, the real laws are the social constructs in biology which go behind them. You know.
Well, yeah. I mean, let's not forget that the Greeks did not particularly see a great difference when they said their laws between the statutes and their customs.
Right, and that's something that Digression actually touches on, drawing from the Greeks, is that good laws are merely customs that have been written down and formalized.
Right, and you can't really quite give the rights of Englishmen to Sunni Muslims. Mm-hmm. It doesn't really work.
It's the rights of Englishmen. They're not these abstract universalisms. They really are the rights of Englishmen.
Right.
Yeah. If you try and run, Afghanistan by English common law, you're going to have absolute chaos. And if you try to run England under Sunni Islam, well, we're seeing how well that works, aren't we?
That's a little harsh.
Oh man,
let's see. I just picked up a passage which kind of shows the aspect of what are you going to use your money for, and what do you enjoy in it. He went to church and walked about the streets and watched the people hurrying to and fro, and patted children on the head and questioned beggars, and looked down into the kitchens of houses and up into the windows, and found that everything could yield him pleasure. He had never dreamed that any walk, that anything could give him so much happiness. In the afternoon, he turned his steps towards his nephew's house.
And notice the things that he says bring him joy are universal across time. Those are things that could bring us pleasure now, mm-hmm. that could have brought Socrates pleasure, that could bring somebody in Mongolia pleasure.
Right.
Those are just sort of universal human things, mm-hmm. which again is what makes Dickens sort of timeless and universal. It's
right.
very similar for Shakespeare too.
Yeah. There's a passage when he's when Scrooge is going through present day, like Christmas, the present day Christmas, and Dickens spends like a whole page describing like everyone's having snowball fights and children are running through the streets and stuff, and you read that and you think, I could see this happening now. This is how people still celebrate Christmas this way. People still spend their winter evenings building snowmen and
saying Merry
sledding,
Christmas and
Merry
getting
Christmas,
charged with a hate crime for
getting
it.
charged with a hate crime for it, and you snowball fights,
Getting sued for putting up a Christmas tree.
Yeah.
Because certain people might take offense.
I think there's a quality when you read old literature, or with the right perspective, or the right kind of history, where you realize these really were people. Like, they're not these alien creatures that lived 200 years ago and then magically transformed in the year 2000 to real people. These were actually real people who lived back there, and they have human qualities. And I think the important thing about humanizing people who lived in the past is that it starts to consider, well, maybe there was something there. Ascribing inhuman qualities to people of the past, making them those dead white men, makes it very easy to discard their ideas or anything they thought about. It makes it easy to erase any sort of past you have and any sort of thoughts in connection to learning from history. But when you can think, wow, these were people, it is very humanizing. And
well, yeah, I mean, look, the whole leftist / Enlightenment narrative of linear history means necessarily the future is always better than the past. Mm-hmm. Maybe a couple dips and minor ups and downs here, but the curve stays the same. Whereas, what that means, if you really look into it, it explains first their inability to learn from the past, and second their view that like the entire world before 1965 was like nothing but rape, lynching, and like shooting natives. Like that's the only thing that ever happened. Like, no, it's really, really not. And humanizing our ancestors, that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to look back and admire our ancestors. That's like every possible, culture in human history. That's what they did. They read the stories of their people. They looked back on their ancestors and admired them and wanted to be like them. That's natural.
That's what
this is
healthy society
unnatural.
does. Right.
And it speaks to what we've lost. We've lost the ability to maintain a culture, not in the abstract sense of, we can't have these nice things like English common law anymore, but to have a culture, because a culture is something that you share with your parents. Like, you and your parents have these experiences and thoughts and ideas and things you can remember and say, we did that together. We can talk about the same things, dream about the same things. And what modern culture does is it slices culture so thin and so fast that you can't talk to someone who's just maybe half a decade behind you, and you're disconnected from them.
Okay. I had that experience when I was watching the Thanksgiving Day Parade this year. The Thanksgiving Parade, they have all these musical acts, right? And out of maybe 24 names, there were precisely 2 of them I recognized, right? I recognized Florida Georgia Line because I'd heard like a song of theirs when I was driving in the car once, and I knew who Mariah Carey was because she's old enough that I remember her from when I was 20. Like everyone else, I was like, who the hell are these people? Someone said of Michael Jackson that Michael Jackson, his importance to culture was he was the last cultural phenomenon that came along before this slicing thin of the culture really revved into high gear. So he was the last pop culture phenomenon that everyone liked. Black people liked him, white people liked him, Asian people liked him, old people, young people, Jews, Christians, everybody got and everybody liked Michael Jackson, right? After that, you end up where we're so disjointed, both from multiculturalism and from this intentional separation of us from each other, and just from the effects of the internet too, that there is not and could not be another cultural phenomenon like that.
Yeah, Elvis Presley could not exist in the year 2000. He couldn't exist in 2017. He might be a famous pop star. He might be wealthy beyond his imagination, but he wouldn't be ubiquitous. He wouldn't be the king of anything because there's no group that he could appeal to as a whole.
I mean, we recognize names like Justin Bieber, Taylor Swift, Katy Perry, whatever, but none of them really speak to us the same way that Elvis or Michael Jackson did.
They're not a phenomenon. Their coin isn't universal. It has value, but not everyone takes it.
I remember reading this thing in like the late 80s about this dude who like wanted the spiritual experience, so he goes up into like the mountains of Nepal, through some pass and survives the snow, gets to this monastery, opens the door, and there's like this old beat up boombox there playing a cassette tape of Thriller. It's like, that's how universal Michael Jackson was. But we have nothing like this now. And, even oddly enough, now the left is kind of a victim of it. Baby boomer and even older Gen X people look at something like 4chan, and the reaction they have is like exactly the same reaction that their parents had when they saw Jimi Hendrix playing at Woodstock. It's like, looking at the TV, dear, why is that Negro playing the guitar with his teeth? It's like, now here we are going like, what is this cartoon frog? Is it a Nazi? Why did these people say that Donald Trump paid hookers to urinate on Michelle Obama's bed? What is the lulz, and why was it for that?
That brings me back. I was
was reading newspapers from the '60s, and their liberal use of the word Negro was quite jarring, including titles like "Negro blew off his fingers."
There you go. The Onion in 1963. Area Negro.
Oh my goodness.
So Dickens.
So Dickens.
Dickens, right?
Yeah. Well, unlike all those other things, Dickens will always be relatable.
It will be. It's just sad. Like I wish there was. I mean, maybe there are some great stories that just haven't come to the forefront because of the slicing of culture. But it doesn't feel like there's much in the way of timeless being done lately. There aren't a whole lot of things made in the year 2017 that will age well. And
this is still a very young year. We'll see.
But
there's not much from the current year, you're saying?
Yeah.
No, fine. Year 2000. There are not many things from the year 2000 which will age well, and that's really what things should do: is age well. When you build something, when you write something, when you want it to be able to age in the best of circumstances, to age so that someone down the line will read it and not think, "What is this? Why does it have these ridiculous pants on, and what sound is it making?"
Why is that Negro playing the guitar with his teeth? Yeah. Well, I mean, if we're going to get all Spenglerian about it, there's the idea that cultures just run out of steam at a certain point. You know, it's sort of like a technology. With any technology, there's really only so far you can take it before it's gone as far as it's ever going to. And you can still invent something new that will do the same thing and do it better, but that's not that original technology. It's like when piston-engined airliners got as far as they were going to. You know, the last generation of them were these hugely complex things that, like, broke down constantly because they were overly complex, because they'd reached the limit of what you could do with that technology. Or, you know, if I was to sit you down and say, invent a better typewriter, you really couldn't. I mean, in 1979, typewriters were about as good as it. You know, an IBM Selectric is about as good a typewriter as you're ever going to be able to invent. Now, we did come along with jet airplanes that did the same thing better, and we did come up with computers that did the same thing better, but again, that's not the same. Same with cultures. You know, there can be a point where you just get a culture that has reached the final expression of everything it can ever really do with itself, and there's really no further to push it.
So, are you implying that there'll be something better but completely different that will come along?
In a couple thousand years, sure.
That's optimistic. I hope something better will come along, at least in hundreds of years. If the world had to wait 1,000 years for another good piece of cultural technology, that would be some rough times.
Well, the good news is Dark Ages aren't as bad as the Enlightenment made them out to be.
Oh, that's true. I mean, if all you had to do was read old books, you couldn't go that wrong, could you?
No, not at all.
Quite honestly, if no new books were written for the next 50 years, it wouldn't be terrible. The world would not come to an end.
Let me ask you this. Let's take something that's very relatable to us. So let's say rock and roll music. When was the last time there was any real new innovation in that? What, like grunge 20 years ago?
Well, even grunge,
if that.
I like some grunge music, but it's different. It's not. I mean, it's not. It would be to the jet engine, to the piston engine on airplanes. Like, I think it's rock met its end, and then it spun out a million different genres.
Well, I think rock was just a 20th century phenomenon, that it can't exist really outside it. We can rehash it, but hey, as long as we're at it, we can rehash Gregorian chants too. You know, we can rehash Beethoven, but, you know, it's John Williams, you know, rehashing every, 18th century classical composer ever, but like that doesn't mean we can really produce new innovative material in that field that's any good.
I mean, it's telling, I think, that the best electronic music I've ever heard is all 80s style vaporwave. Like, it's all like
Synthwave. Oh yeah,
synthwave.
That's totally the music of the alt-right right there.
Amazing. That stuff's awesome.
Well, and I was reading a description of it on some like fan website, and it's trying to capture the feeling of the 80s. Not
Right.
necessarily what it actually sounded like, but the
But
feeling.
like, the feeling, right?
Right.
You can look at that and think like that's not how the 80s actually was, but
it's how they should have been.
it's how it should have been. Right?
It's the 80s of Miami Vice and
Right.
Arnold Schwarzenegger movies of that era and all
Right.
of that, which was sort of the 80s but kind of wasn't. But still, I mean, it's no accident that this is sort of like Trump era stuff, because let's face
Right.
it, the whole Trump phenomenon is like, okay, you know what? Everything after Reagan left office was kind of a mistake. Let's just kind of go back to that.
It's interesting. Someone pointed out that the Nixon-Reagan era was the working class realizing that the FDR New Deal wasn't made for them.
No, it wasn't. And
I think that the Trump era is kind of the rest of the working class who didn't get the memo and were a day late to school, realizing that the Clinton machine wasn't what they thought it was, and it wasn't for them. And I think there's something to America First and Build the Wall, which rings, this is for you. Like, and it may be the same selling tool of the New Deal, which is this is for you, but it's speaking to the people. It spoke to the people who had been waiting for the working class savior for quite a while.
All the overtly anti-white stuff of especially the last 4 years. I mean, it delivered its message. People got it.
Right.
As I saw one description of like why the Democrats lost of being, they did things that took Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin from 48% red to 52% red, because those are the same things that took New York and California from being 60% blue to 65% blue. Well, what this election just showed is like, it doesn't matter if you win California by 1 vote or 1 million votes. The electoral votes either go one way or the other.
Right.
The thing is, if you don't win Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, you're done. And just pushing it way too far. And I don't think they're going to learn their lesson. I think it's wonderful that they think they lost this election because of Russian hacking.
Right.
Because get ready, because for the next 8 years, Russian hacking of the election is going to be the new Obama's birth certificate for Democrats. And we're never going to hear the end of it, and they won't learn a damn thing from it, and it's going to be fantastic.
It's so pathetic. I wish I could be in that mindset and like have some empathy for them, but I can't. It's like this was like at best a 2-time event, which maybe have played a small role in changing maybe a few thousand people's minds. But really and truly, it wasn't that big a deal.
Well, it's not even that. It's like, it even just confirmed things we already knew. We already knew Hillary Clinton was corrupt. We already knew the Clintons were sleazebags. We knew that in 1993.
Right.
Well, I mean, but that's the thing, is that was dirty laundry that was never supposed to be aired. It was, that was sacred ground. These were the Clintons, and people could think that, but they could never know.
By the way, looking at the clock here, we've been recording for 1 hour and 20 minutes, and I'd say we talked about Dickens for about, 6-7 minutes of that?
I hope we got the 30.
We got a pretty significant aspect of Dickens. I would.
Last thing about A Christmas Carol, or unless you guys have something else to bring up. So, A Christmas Carol was written in a very sort of transitional period for Dickens. He can really be sort of divided into his earlier works, which were much more saccharine, much more sentimental, and his later works, which were much darker, had a much higher body count. And people tend to gravitate towards his early works because they're much more sort of troll-friendly because they're sentimental.
Right.
Whereas me, being an actual Dickens scholar, I like his later works much better. I mean, my personal favorite is Bleak House, with Great X and Tale of Two Cities being kind of really close behind. And really, the dividing line's around, 1850 or so.
1850.
So, you've got something... sorry, you can cut that clause out. You have something really, really saccharine and sentimental like The Old Curiosity Shop, which he'd written a couple years before A Christmas Carol. And A Christmas Carol actually sort of is directly responsible for Bleak House having been written.
Right.
Because what happened was Dickens published A Christmas Carol, became a huge hit, and people immediately started ripping him off. And, if you think this whole thing about like intellectual property ripoff began with Napster, no. So like these magazines would reprint either A Christmas Carol word for word, or have like thinly veiled rewritten versions of it with the names mildly changed, written by some hack or something. And, he would get no money for it. So he sued him. And he ended up having such a horrible time in Chancery Court that he ended up writing Bleak House about the experience of how miserable it was to have to sue anybody and how he would never, never, ever do it again. And hold on while I find that.
It is interesting, too, when you consider, like, relating this all back to Carlyle as well, is that there's also, like, prior to, I guess, prior to the Latter-day Pamphlets, and even, I can't remember, like, I don't know exactly where the demarcation would be for Carlyle, but there is, like, an earlier Carlyle and a later Carlyle, where previously Carlyle seemed to be much more in favor of, like, reforming, a little bit more of a reformer, close to what Dickens, remained throughout his entire life, I think. Even in spite of Dickens' latter-day pessimism, I think he still remains something of a reformer. But, like, there's sort of that sort of, the transitional period with both Dickens and Carlyle, where both of them became a little more cynical and a little more pessimistic for what they were. Dickens still, I think, I would argue, is probably still Carlyle light, and he never went so far as Carlyle in terms of, slavery or anything like that.
Okay, so here's the passage I was looking for out of Chapter 1 of Bleak House, which is sort of a fictionalized trip through the Chancery Court system, which reflects his own bad experience with it. This is the Court of Chancery, which has its decaying houses and its blighted lands in every shire, which has its worn-out lunatic in every madhouse and its dead in every churchyard, which has its ruined suitor with his slipshod heels and threadbare dress burrowing and begging through the round of every man's acquaintance, which gives to moneyed might the means of abundantly wearing out the right, which so exhausts finances, patience, courage, hope, so overthrows the brain and breaks the heart, that there is not an honorable man among its practitioners who does not often give the warning, suffer any wrong that can be done you rather than come here. So,
yeah, that's a Bleak House.
I wonder, I would love to bring Dickens to any modern day bureaucracy and see if it was any better or any worse, and have him describe it as such.
Well, yeah, look, that's again what I would say about us is all of these 19th century reformers, some of whom were right about stuff. Hey, I'm glad we've got somebody making sure that there isn't excessive amounts of rat poop in our burgers. Okay, fine with me.
Only moderate amounts of rat poop. Perfectly manageable.
But we are also on the other end of 150 years worth of experience from them. And we know what works and what doesn't. I mean, I I may be being generous here, but I would still like to believe that if we showed Karl Marx what actually happened when his ideas were put into effect, that he would have chucked the whole thing in the fire. Because, leftism always ends up producing the exact opposite of what it said it was going to. And, we starved 60 million Chinese peasants and we're destroying the white race for, I don't know, because we took these ideas and did something with them. That's not what he had in mind. Like, oh, we destroyed the family.
Yeah.
Oops.
So bourgeois.
So, if you don't mind, I have a little passage selected from Carlyle about his own experience, his own thoughts on the state. The state once brought to its veracities by the thumbscrew in this manner, what will it think of these same seminaries and cathedrals? I foresee that our Etons and Oxfords, with their nonsense verses, college logics, and broken crumbs of mere speech, which is not even English or Teutonic speech, but old Grecian and Italian speech, dead and buried and much lying out of our ways for these 2,000 years past, will be found a most astonishing seminary for the training of these young English souls to take command in human industries and act a valiant part under the sun. The state does not want vocables, but mainly wisdoms and virtues. The state does it want parliamentary orators, first of all, and men capable of writing books. What a rag fair of extinct mockeries, high pilloried here in these very shrine of our existence, fit to smite the generations with atrophy and beggarly paralysis. As we see it do, the Ministry of Education will not want for work, I think, in the new Downing Street.
Funny, I was just listening to Stefan Molyneux's podcast on McCarthy, and how everything you think you know about McCarthy and McCarthyism is exactly opposite of what happened. Everything that Hollywood has spent 50 years telling you about that is believe the exact opposite of that and you're not far off. And he noted how the actual communists that were in the government, if you look at their education, it's Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Yale, right. Harvard, yeah. Oxford.
But I've been wanting to watch that, and it's a subject it's very interesting because it is a period piece in that if you actually read leftists from the period, especially if they were involved in the foreign service, what's it called?
The State Department?
State Department, Foggy Bottom. They will bitch and moan about McCarthy. And you'll read their reports, and it's merely that they had to have the pretense of caring about communists. That maybe they shouldn't be friendly with the communists. Maybe they should have the pretense of not being communists. The actual disruptions in their lives were so minor and petty that it's sad that he was their demon and not someone worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, they will lose their shit at literally anybody who shows the least bit of not even true rightness. Okay, when they say someone is a right-wing extremist, they don't actually mean policy positions.
No.
Mm-hmm. They see it in terms of how effective that person is against them.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Let's face it, a couple of twists and turns aside, Donald Trump just ran on Bill Clinton's 1992 platform.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And the problem, screaming that he's a Nazi, no. He's just really rhetorically good at beating you.
Right.
Same thing with McCarthy. I mean, and any of us would be gassing up the helicopters. McCarthy just said, hey, maybe these people shouldn't be writing Hollywood movies that, or in charge of our nuclear secrets or stuff like that.
Right.
And it is just the roadblocks get the hate. If you manage to be a roadblock for the left, God help you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is a warning to everyone is if you actually start to be too effective, God help you. Which doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but just be prepared and know that if you actually are effective roadblock, that's when people start paying attention.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, it's got to be so frustrating. They have thrown everything they can think of at Trump, and so far it just has not worked at all. You know, it's like, well, the CIA says he hired hookers to piss on Michelle Obama's bed. It's like, okay, these would be the same CIA who didn't know that Mao Zedong was a communist, who didn't see the invasion of Korea coming, who couldn't figure out that Fidel Castro was a communist, who didn't see him putting nuclear missiles into Cuba until it was too late, who couldn't figure out that our adventure in Vietnam would go exactly the same way that the French had 10 years earlier, who didn't see the Iranian Revolution coming, who didn't figure out that Saddam Hussein was about to invade Iraq, and who 10 years after that told us that Iraq was filled with WMDs after they didn't see 9/11 coming, and then couldn't find Osama bin Laden for 10 years when he was living half a block away from a Pakistani military base. So those were the guys who came up with this story. Yeah, color me not surprised that they just got epically pranked by 4chan.
I don't know the exact turn of events which led to that, but it's
apparently what happened is,
well, no. I mean, like it's you never know in that situation. You never know what exactly happened, but it's neither believable nor particularly relevant.
no, the story is beautiful because the story is 4chan came up with this prank, somehow ended up passing it to Rick Wilson of Trump fans masturbate to anime fame. He passed it to Evan McMullin. Evan McMullin gave it to the CIA, and the CIA briefed Trump and Obama on it. So,
Oh my gosh.
I actually have a funny story about the Iranian Revolution. A personal friend of mine was in Iran about 2 weeks before the revolution, and nobody told the CIA that the revolution was happening. But my friend who had business in Iran was told, you should leave now. And he left. And 2 weeks later, they stormed the American embassy and held everyone hostage, and the revolution happened. So it was not impossible to know that the Iranian Revolution was happening, and if you happened to be friends with someone in Iran and they liked you, they might have told you.
yeah, well, you know, making friends does not exactly seem to be what the CIA is good at.
No.
And
Yeah.
currently someone who is not really very friendly with them is 6 days away from becoming president. So,
Right.
I mean, that's the thing with the CIA and the FBI both. If you shoot an arrow at the king, you better not miss.
Right.
So, there's going to be a lot of people taking an early retirement.
Well, on that note, I'd like to say that friendship is magic.
Caligula's counsel. Friendship is magic.
So, you know what? Seriously, someday we should sit down and watch a few episodes of My Little Pony and do a show on it.
I will politely decline that offer. Well, I think
We
You
all
do it
know,
on your show.
we all know that Rainbow Dash is your waifu.
Oh my goodness. I don't want to know what that means. I really don't. Have we wrapped it up?
On that note, I think we've exhausted pretty much all I've wanted to say about A Christmas Carol.
It's not a particularly long book. It's a great book. You should read it, but it's not particularly long.
It's excellent, and if you're, you know, even though the Christmas season is over, you absolutely should read it. I'm not familiar with any adaptations that I would recommend. I've heard the Muppet one is good. I don't know.
The 1952 British version with Alistair Sim is actually really, really good. It's my favorite. Believe it or not, I'm actually pretty fond of Scrooged. I know I kind of made fun of it a little bit, but it gets the spirit right, and also, you know, Bill Murray. So.
Right. Yeah. So it's definitely worth reading, and especially, you know, again, even if you are only cursorily familiar with Carlyle, there are some Carlylean aspects of it, particularly where Scrooge becomes sort of the second father to Tiny Tim, and his turn as a as a man of duty and as a man of compassion and kindness, rather than simply a rich guy who sits alone in his cold house counting his money.
And masturbating to anime.
That. Thank you.
You just know he's got a waifu pillow.
I would like to. I don't know.
Bet he's the type to go for rarity.
Well, he did. He did get dumped by his true love back in who knows what era.
Right.
He doesn't seem to be bothered by that. I mean, besides the fact that he's missing out on life.
You mean he doesn't seem to be bothered by that, other than the fact that at an extremely advanced age he comes to the realization that he has wasted his entire life on nothing?
Yes, but it's not like his first thing is to be like, you know, he goes out and buys a turkey. He doesn't go out and buy, like, a woman.
No.
It could have ended differently.
But even in Victorian England, that was kind of a tall order.
Yeah.
No, I didn't mean it that way, but
right.
I mean...
He'd at least have to have taken a boat to Georgia and gone and found an auctioneer.
But it's nice. It's nice to see a story. I mean, we all value love and relationships, but it's nice to see a story that ends on a more positive note than just finding a young wife.
Hey, remember, the antebellum South had a perfectly reasonable policy on race. If you don't like black people, don't buy one.
This is going downhill quickly.
on that note.
We'll be back soon to talk about the man in the high castle, because, we didn't step on enough toes this time.
In the next episode, we'll talk about Carlyle's work, The Nigger Question. On that note, thank you for listening. This has been Caligula's Council. I'm Count Nothingface.
I'm 188 Watson.
I'm Anti-Dem, and everybody remember Sunset Shimmer is most reactionary pony.
Thank you for coming on the show, Anti-Dem. We really appreciate it. And on that note, we'll see you all next time.